You already know this story, or at least you know a version of it. 300 Spartans standing in a narrow mountain pass, holding back an ocean of enemies. A last stand for freedom against a monstrous invading horde. A god king on a golden throne watching his countless slaves hurl themselves at a handful of free men. It is one of the most famous war stories ever told, retold in histories, in paintings, and in a Hollywood film where the heroes have perfect bodies and the villain is a 9-foot tyrant covered in gold. It is a story about the birth of freedom and the defiance of Eastern tyranny. And it has been told for 2,500 years by one side, because to the people on the other side, this was not a clash of civilizations for the soul of humanity. It was a border problem, a frontier campaign on the distant western edge of the largest empire the world had ever seen. To the great king of Persia, ruling from a throne at the center of the known world, the Greeks were not the heroes of history. They were a troublesome people on the far rim of his domain. So let us do something the storytellers rarely do. Let us turn the story around. This is the war between Persia and Greece, told not from the pass at Thermopylae, but from the throne room at Persepolis. Before we begin, we have to be honest about a problem. Almost everything we know about these wars comes from the Greeks. Above all, it comes from one man, a Greek writer named Herodotus, who composed his great history a generation after the fighting for a Greek-speaking audience. He is a wonderful, curious, and often surprisingly fair storyteller. But he was writing the story of a war his own people had won, and it shows. The Persians, by contrast, left us almost nothing about these campaigns. Their royal inscriptions boast of building palaces and crushing rebels, but the war with the Greeks barely registers. It is entirely possible that, to the Persian court, these events were simply not important enough to carve into stone. So, to see the war from the Persian side, we cannot simply read a Persian version, because there isn't one. We have to take the Greek story, the only detailed account we have, and read it carefully against the grain, asking at every turn, how would this same event have looked from the other end of the empire? And to do that, we first have to understand just how vast that empire really was. By the early 5th century BC, the Persian Empire was not merely a large kingdom. It was the largest empire the world had ever seen. Founded a few generations earlier by Cyrus the Great, it stretched from the edge of India in the east, across the whole of the Middle East, to Egypt in the south and the shores of the Aegean Sea in the west. Tens of millions of people, dozens of nations and languages lived under a single crown. And this was no crude war machine of the kind the Greek stories imply. It was one of the most sophisticated states the ancient world ever produced. The Persians divided their empire into provinces, each run by a governor called a satrap. They built a royal road running for well over 2,000 kilometers, with way stations and relays of fresh horses, so that royal messengers could carry news across the empire at a speed that would not be matched for centuries. They standardized coinage, and famously, they largely allowed their conquered peoples to keep their own gods, laws, and customs, so long as they paid their taxes and kept the peace. When Cyrus took Babylon, he presented himself not as a destroyer, but as a liberator and a restorer of order. Its army, too, was more than the faceless mass of the legend. At its heart stood the king's elite guard, 10,000 professional soldiers the Greeks called the Immortals, because the moment one of them fell, another instantly stepped into his place, keeping their number forever at exactly 10,000. This was the Persian self-image, not a horde of slaves under a tyrant, but the guarantors of peace and order across the whole civilized world, gathered under one just and rightful king. And at the center of that world sat the man the Greeks would learn to fear and to caricature, the King of Kings. The Persians called their ruler the King of Kings, the Great King, and in their eyes, he was something close to the hinge of the world. In the Persian religious vision, the universe was a battleground between truth and order on one side, and falsehood and chaos on the other. And the king was the earthly champion of order. It was his sacred task to hold back the lie, to keep the peace, to make the world run as it should. When he sat in judgment in his great columned halls at Persepolis, receiving the tribute and the ambassadors of the world, he was not, to his own people, a monster. He was the guarantor of a just and ordered universe. The Greek stories would take this king and turn him into a cartoon, a soft, cruel despot lounging on his throne while whipping his slaves into battle. But it is worth remembering that this was a caricature drawn by his enemies. To the millions inside his empire, the great king was the center that held their entire world together. Two of these kings concern our story. First, Darius I, a brilliant administrator who built much of the empire's machinery. And then his son, the king whose name would become, for the Greeks, a byword for pride itself, Xerxes. But before Xerxes, before the Great Invasion, the trouble began, as trouble so often does, out on the edges of the map. On the western coast of Anatolia, in the land the Greeks called Ionia, there lived Greek cities that had come, over time, under Persian rule. They paid tribute to the great king and were governed by local rulers loyal to Persia. And in 499 BC, they revolted. The Ionian cities rose up against their Persian overlords, and crucially, they asked for help from across the sea, from the free Greek cities of the mainland. Two of those cities answered, Athens and a smaller city, Eretria. They sent ships and men. The combined force marched inland and attacked Sardis, the seat of Persian power in the whole region. And in the fighting, the great city was burned to the ground. Now stop and look at this moment from the Persian side, because this is where, for them, the whole war truly begins. From the throne at Persepolis, what had happened was simple and outrageous. Subjects of the empire had risen in rebellion, and a foreign power, the city of Athens, from beyond the empire's borders, had sent an army to help those rebels and to burn one of the king's great cities. This was not, to Persian eyes, a heroic struggle for freedom. It was rebellion, and it was aggression. It was a wound that both honor and order demanded be answered. From the Greek side, of course, this looked entirely different. To the Ionians and to the Athenians who sailed to help them, it was a struggle to be free of a foreign master. Both things were true at the same time. And that double truth runs through the entire war. The revolt was eventually crushed, but the king did not forget the foreigners who had lit the fire. Athens had made itself a name in Persepolis, and not a good one. In 490 BC, Darius sent a force across the Aegean to settle accounts, above all with Athens and Eretria, the cities that had dared to help the rebels and burned Sardis. The expedition sacked Eretria. Then it landed on the coast of Attica, on a plain called Marathon, within striking distance of Athens itself. What happened next became one of the most celebrated events in Greek history. The Athenians, outnumbered in the Greek telling, marched out to meet the Persians on the plain, charged, and won a stunning victory, driving the invaders back into the sea. In Athens, Marathon would be remembered forever as the day free citizens saved their city against impossible odds. A runner is said to have carried the news back to Athens and died as he delivered it, giving us, many centuries later, the name of a race. But look at the same day from Persepolis. A punitive expedition, one modest force sent to the far western frontier of an empire that stretched to India, had been repulsed by a single Greek city. It was an irritation, an unfinished piece of business. It did not threaten the empire. The empire barely felt it. Darius simply began to plan to do the job properly, before old age and death took the task out of his hands and passed it to his son. For the Greeks, Marathon was a miracle that defined them forever. For Persia, it was a frontier setback to be corrected, and correcting it would become the obsession of the next king. When Darius died, his son Xerxes inherited the throne, the empire, and the unfinished business in the West. And Xerxes resolved to settle the Greek question once and for all, not with a raid, but with the full, overwhelming weight of the empire. The preparations were staggering, and they were meant to be. Xerxes summoned soldiers from across his vast domains, dozens of peoples marching under one banner. He had engineers cut a canal straight through a peninsula so his fleet could avoid a dangerous cape. And most famously of all, to move his army from Asia into Europe, he had hundreds of ships lashed together across the Hellespont, the strait that divides the continents, with a road of timber laid across their decks, so that an army could march from one continent to another on a bridge of boats. How big was that army? The Greek sources say millions. Herodotus counts them in the millions of men. Almost no modern historian believes this. The real figure was likely in the hundreds of thousands, still one of the largest forces assembled anywhere in the ancient world, but a fraction of the ocean of men in the legend. The vast numbers served the Greek story, making the eventual victory more miraculous and the Persian king more monstrous. Herodotus even tells us that when a storm smashed Xerxes' first bridge, the enraged king ordered the sea itself to be whipped 300 times as punishment, a perfect little parable of Eastern pride and folly. Whether it truly happened, or whether it was a tale the Greeks told to make their enemy look mad, we simply cannot know. To Xerxes, none of this was madness. It was a demonstration to the whole world that the reach of the great king had no limit. He was coming to Greece to restore order. He did not imagine for a moment that he could lose. In 480 BC, the great army crossed into Europe and rolled south through northern Greece. Most of the small states in its path surrendered or joined it. Against a force like this, resistance seemed like madness. But a league of southern cities, led by Sparta and Athens, chose to fight. They chose their ground well, a narrow pass between the mountains and the sea called Thermopylae, where the vast Persian numbers would count for little. There was a hard military reality beneath this. The heavily armored Greek foot soldier, the hoplite, fighting shoulder to shoulder in a tight wall of shields and spears, was one of the most formidable things in the ancient world. On an open plain, Persian cavalry and archers ruled, but followed into a narrow space against that wall of bronze, sheer numbers could count for surprisingly little. There, a small Greek force, its heart the famous 300 Spartans under their king Leonidas, blocked the road. And here, the Greek legend reaches its peak. For 2 days, the Greeks held the pass, and the huge Persian army could not break through. It is a genuinely extraordinary feat of arms, and it deserves its fame. But then, a local man showed the Persians a mountain path that led around the pass. The Greeks were outflanked. Most of the army withdrew, but Leonidas and his Spartans, along with a few hundred others, stayed to fight and died where they stood. From the Persian side, Thermopylae was a costly, infuriating delay. It had held them up and bled them, but in the end, the pass was theirs. The Greeks who defended it were dead, and the road south lay open. A tactical bump on the road to victory. To the Greeks, it was, and remains, perhaps the most celebrated last stand in all of history. The same handful of days, 2 completely different stories. And to the Persians, the next move looked like the winning one. With the pass forced, the Persian army poured into central Greece, and its greatest prize lay open before it. Athens. The Athenians made a desperate and brilliant decision. They abandoned their city. They evacuated their people to nearby islands and put their faith and almost their entire fighting strength into their navy. When the Persians arrived, they found Athens all but empty. They took it, and they burned it, including the temples on the sacred hill of the Acropolis. Imagine how this looked from Xerxes' side. 10 years earlier, the Athenians had crossed the sea and burned Sardis. Now the king had crossed the sea and burned Athens. The account in Persian eyes was balanced. The city that had insulted the empire and armed its rebels was a smoking ruin. The wrong that began at Sardis had been answered in full. From the throne, in that moment, the war must have looked won. The great punitive campaign his father could not finish, Xerxes had completed. Greece was overrun, and its most defiant city lay in ashes. But the Greeks had not surrendered. They had simply moved the war to the one place the great king's soldiers could not march: the sea. The Greek fleet, built largely by the Athenians in the years before the invasion, had gathered in the narrow strait between the mainland and an island called Salamis, just off the coast from their own burning city. The Persian navy was larger, and that, it turned out, was the trap. The Athenian leader Themistocles found a way, by cunning and perhaps by a false message, to lure the huge Persian fleet into the narrow waters of the strait, where its greater numbers could not spread out, and where its ships became crowded, tangled, and vulnerable. There, the lighter, well-handled Greek ships tore into them. By the tradition, Xerxes had a throne set up on the shore to watch his fleet crush the Greeks. Instead, he watched it destroyed. The Battle of Salamis was a catastrophe for the Persian navy, and it changed everything. Without control of the sea, the enormous Persian army could not be reliably fed and supplied, and Xerxes himself risked being cut off in Europe if the Greeks sailed north to break his bridge across the Hellespont. And so the great king made a cold decision. He withdrew, taking much of the army back toward Asia in a long and bitter retreat in which, the sources say, many died of hunger and disease. He left behind his best general, Mardonius, with a picked force to finish the conquest the following year. The king himself had gone home, and with him went any certainty that this war was already won. The next year, 479 BC, the war reached its decision. Mardonius, with his powerful army, spent months maneuvering, negotiating, and trying to break the Greek alliance apart. But the southern Greek cities, for once, held together. They assembled the largest Greek army ever put into the field, and the two sides finally met near the town of Plataea. It was a hard, uncertain, day-long struggle. But in the end, the Greek heavy infantry, the armored hoplites fighting on ground of their own choosing, shattered the Persian force. Mardonius himself was killed, and with his death and the destruction of his army, the Persian attempt to conquer mainland Greece was over. Around the same time, the tradition says, on the very same day, the remnant of the Persian fleet was destroyed across the sea at a place called Mycale. The invasion was finished. The surviving Persian forces withdrew from Greece, and the great king's great enterprise, the campaign to fold the Greeks into his empire, had failed. But here is where the two sides of the story diverge most sharply of all. Because for Persia, this ending was far less of an ending than the Greeks would ever admit. When the Greeks remembered these wars, they remembered the end of the world and its rescue. A tiny band of free peoples had stood against the greatest empire on earth and, impossibly, thrown it back. It was the moment, they came to believe, when Greek freedom and everything that would grow from it had been saved. Out of that conviction came a way of seeing the world that has never fully left us. The free West against the despotic East, liberty against tyranny. Herodotus wrote it down. Later, Greeks and Romans repeated it. Europe made it a founding myth. 2,500 years later, it became a film called 300. It is worth noticing how completely that victory of the story worked. Even now, most of us picture these wars almost exactly as Herodotus wanted us to. The brave few against the servile many. We see them still through the winner's eyes. Now look at the same events from Persia. The empire had lost a frontier war. It was an embarrassment, certainly, and a failure. But it was not a catastrophe. Persia remained exactly what it had been the day before Xerxes crossed the Hellespont, the largest and richest empire on earth. It would go on ruling its vast domains and meddling in Greek affairs with gold and diplomacy for another century and a half. The Persian Empire was not brought down by Sparta or Athens. It fell, much later, to a different Greek altogether, a Macedonian king named Alexander, who marched east and burned Persepolis itself in 330 BC. So who was right about the war? In a sense, both of them, and that is the real lesson. The same event can be the founding epic of one people and a half-forgotten frontier failure to another. History is not simply what happened. It is what someone chose to write down and pass on and build an identity around. The Greeks lost far more men and cities in these wars than Persia ever did. But they won the one thing that outlasts everything else. They won the story.